Hello there, this is Yana Smakula for Paper Tray Ink, and thank you for joining me today. In this video, I will show you how to create thank you cards personalized with constellation images, and I will also share how to do simple watercolor galaxy using Paper Tray Ink inks. I wanted to create a set of simple yet striking cards and incorporate a little bit of heat embossing and watercolor. Usually when these two things are combined, the paper tends to warp a bit. Because I was going for a very clean look, I wanted to avoid having my background warp at all cost. So I decided to do heat embossing and watercolor on a separate layer. This led me to an idea of using a die, a coordinating die in fact, to die cut a shape for my project. Whenever we think of simple shapes to cut for our cards, our minds instantly go to the most basic shapes like circles or rectangles or squares. I decided to be a little bit more creative today and went with a Monstero leaf die from the Palm Prints die set. The reason I picked this particular die is because of its size. I wanted to use a unique shape that was large enough to showcase the constellations I was planning to heat emboss on it. You can choose to use other shapes for this. Think about all of those stamps and coordinating die shapes and try to find a shape that is solid enough and large enough to house a non-coordinating image like this constellation. It can be a critter shape, a flower shape, or a different kind of leaf shape. Try to pick something that is clearly defined even without the coordinating stamp. I'm going to use my Platinum 6 die cutting machine and Distress watercolor cardstock and going to die cut several leaves out. I am making a couple cards today, so I'm cutting multiples. You'll want to use watercolor paper for this technique as we will be adding quite a bit of water when we go to paint the galaxy, so it is best to go with a kind of paper that is designed to take a lot of water. After my die cutting is done, I'm going to heat emboss several constellations onto these shapes. Not every constellation fits perfectly here, but that is okay. I do not mind having some lines go outside the leaf as long as the general constellation shape is clearly visible. I picked several constellations, and as I was heat embossing them, I also wrote the name of the constellation on the back of my die cut. I was never very good at astronomy, so I can't tell one constellation from another. And to save myself from making embarrassing mistakes, I labeled each of my leaves on the back to later pair it with the correct sentiment. I used gold embossing powder for all of my leaves, for all of my constellations. It's best to use a metallic color for the most striking result, although you can also go with white and maybe spray your watercolored leaf with some shimmer later. Now let's go ahead and paint quick and simple watercolor galaxies on those leaves. I promise you, there's nothing difficult to it. I'm just going to layer some color and let the paper do the work for me. I'm using Paper Tray Ink pads for my watercolors. I found they react rather nicely with water and allow me to do nice and basic watercoloring. I'm using 4 colors. Hawaiian Shores is my lightest color, and I've pressed the ink pad onto my non-stick craft mat, and I'm now using a water brush to add water and transfer the color onto my die cut. I'm adding this lightest color along the lines of the heat embossed constellation and also in a few sections onto the leaf. There really is no right or wrong way to do it, you just want to layer color. The next color that I'm using is Blueberry Sky, and again, I'm picking it up with my brush and adding it onto my images. I'm coloring all 4 die cuts at once, and by the time I come back to the first leaf to add the second color, the previous layer, the previous color is dry, and I can just layer away. If you're coloring just one leaf, I recommend you use a heat tool to dry your layers. One tip I will give you is to heat emboss the image first and do coloring later. And you'll want to do this for 2 reasons. First, you'll want the constellation area to be the lightest with a few dark spots, and if you don't have the image embossed first, you can't really tell what color you need to add and where you need to add it. And reason number 2, you'll have to wait for the paper to be completely dry to do heat embossing and make sure it is perfect. And waiting for it to dry is another step that takes extra time. So now I'm using my next color, which is dark indigo. Basically, I'm going from teal to medium blue to dark blue. And finally, I'm going to come in around the edges and also in a few sections in the middle of my die cuts with black. You can also spray this die cut with shimmer spray if you want. You can heat emboss the edges of the die cut with gold embossing powder. You can also die cut little gold stars and adhere them onto this element. There are really a lot of ways to spice this up. I, however, am keeping my die cuts rather simple. So here are all of my leaves watercolored. You can tell that each and every one of them is different. Even if I wanted to make them identical, I wouldn't be able to because this is the beauty of watercolor. You always get slightly different results. The next step is to stamp sentiments onto background panels and finish these projects. I'm using my Mini Misty today and stamping sentiments in true black ink. The sentiments that I'm using come from two different stamp sets. The constellation names come from the Stargazer stamp set, and the Note of Thanks sentiment comes from the Bold and Beautiful stamp set. I'm stamping these onto smaller panels. These will go onto 4-bar note cards, so these panels are cut to about 3 by 4 5/8 inches. I've also stamped a panel for an A2 card. I decided I wanted to make a romantic love you card, so I used love always and forever sentiment and also added a sub-sentiment that reads, "You don't need to promise me the moon and stars, just promise me you will stand under them with me forever." Such a beautiful message. You can also make these cards to be personalized birthday cards or miss you cards. Really, there are a lot of different possibilities. I also stamped a few test panels just to show you different placement options for these cards. I did not use them, but I still wanted to share them here. So these are using the same stamps, they're just combined slightly differently. Now let's go back to our cards. I'm going to use glue and will adhere my Galaxy Constellation leaves onto my stamped backgrounds. I am not using foam adhesive, but rather adding a little bit of glue along the center line of each leaf. The paper warped from heat embossing and water, and each leaf now looks slightly dimensional, a bit curved and a bit warped, adding to the overall wow look and feel of these cards. You can also shape each of those leaves with your fingers and add even more dimension if you like. I'm also going to stamp several tiny stars in black ink, making it look like they are scattered along my background. To finish these cards, I foam mounted my panels onto 4-bar and A2 white top folding cards. I love the way these turned out, very clean and simple, yet striking and unique. I'd like to encourage you to pull out your stamps and inks and create identical or similar projects. So this finishes this video. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope I was able to inspire you to create. I will see you next time. Bye!